Hey guys, tonight we're talking about a drug that literally eats you alive from the inside out. Krokodil turns human skin into something resembling crocodile scales before rotting it off completely, exposing muscle and bone to open air. Users typically die within 2 to 3 years of their first injection, though some make it only months. The drug costs about $8 to make in a kitchen using gasoline, paint thinner, and matchsticks. Here's the truly insane part. Scientists originally created this chemical as a safer alternative to morphine, something to help people instead of destroying them. That noble intention lasted exactly 70 years before desperate addicts in Siberia turned it into the most visually horrifying drug epidemic the modern world has ever witnessed. The pharmaceutical industry spent decades searching for a painkiller that wouldn't addict patients, and they technically succeeded. They just didn't account for what would happen when poverty-stricken users mixed their invention with hydrochloric acid and injected it 15 times a day. Dear viewers, our big goal is to reach 1,000 subscribers on this channel, and with your support we can achieve it. Only on our channel will you find such interesting and unique stories about drugs. Subscribe so you don't miss them. We are sincerely grateful to everyone who helps us achieve this goal. Also, write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious to see people from all over the world brought together by a single story. And now, let's move on to today's story. To understand Krokodil, you first need to understand desomorphine, the pharmaceutical compound that spawned this monster. The year was 1932. An American chemist, Lyndon Frederick Small, was working at the University of Virginia, attempting to synthesize opioid compounds that might treat pain without the addiction profile of morphine. Small wasn't some rogue scientist cooking chemicals in a basement. He held a respectable position in academic research, publishing papers in legitimate journals, chasing the same dream that motivated hundreds of pharmaceutical researchers during that era. The medical establishment desperately wanted painkillers that wouldn't enslave patients to dependency. Morphine worked brilliantly for pain, but it destroyed lives through addiction with ruthless efficiency. Small modified the morphine molecule by removing a hydroxyl group and adding a few other tweaks to the chemical structure. The result was desomorphine, a compound that proved 8 to 10 times more potent than morphine while acting much faster in the body. The speed was both blessing and curse. Desomorphine provided pain relief within 2 to 3 minutes of injection, compared to morphine's 10 to 15 minutes. Patients loved the rapid onset. Surgeons appreciated having a powerful tool that worked immediately. The problem revealed itself just as quickly. The effects vanished within 90 minutes, while morphine lasted 4 to 8 hours. Doctors found themselves administering doses much more frequently, which meant more chances for things to go wrong. The addiction potential wasn't lower at all. Some argued it was actually worse because the short duration created a vicious cycle of craving and redosing. Pharmaceutical companies lost interest fast. Why manufacture a drug that required constant administration when morphine did the job with less hassle? Desomorphine became a footnote in chemistry textbooks, barely remembered except by specialists. Only one company saw potential in Small's creation. Roche, the Swiss pharmaceutical giant, began producing desomorphine under the brand name Permanid in the 1940s. Switzerland used it for specific surgical procedures and severe pain management cases where rapid onset justified the short duration. Doctors administered it in controlled hospital settings, never as take-home medication. The Swiss maintained tight controls on distribution. Permanid never became widely available even in Switzerland, let alone exported to other countries. By the 1980s, even Roche had mostly abandoned the drug in favour of newer synthetic opioids. Desomorphine faded into complete obscurity, remembered by almost no one outside pharmaceutical history circles. The compound sat dormant in chemical databases, a failed experiment from a bygone era. Nobody suspected that 70 years after its creation, desomorphine would return as humanity's most flesh-destructive street drug. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and Russia spiraled into economic chaos throughout the 1990s. Oligarchs seized state assets while ordinary citizens watched their savings evaporate through hyperinflation. Factories closed across Siberia and the industrial heartland. Unemployment in some regions hit 40%. The social safety net disintegrated. State-funded addiction treatment centers shut down. Heroin from Afghanistan flooded into Russia through newly porous borders, and a generation of desperate young men found temporary escape in opioids. By the early 2000s, Russia had approximately 2 million heroin users, one of the highest rates in the world. Then the government cracked down. Border controls tightened. Police began seizing major shipments. The heroin supply didn't disappear, but prices skyrocketed. A single gram that once cost $30 or $40 now demanded $150 or more. Addicts faced an impossible choice: suffer through agonizing withdrawal or find alternatives. Somewhere in Siberia around 2002 or 2003, an unnamed chemist rediscovered desomorphine synthesis. The identity remains unknown to this day. Perhaps some resourceful addict with chemistry knowledge stumbled across the formula in an old Soviet pharmaceutical manual. Maybe a former lab technician remembered obscure recipes from university training. Russian authorities never identified patient zero for Krokodil's street synthesis. What matters is that someone realized desomorphine could be manufactured using codeine as the starting material, and codeine was sold over the counter in Russian pharmacies without prescription. The synthesis required only basic chemistry knowledge and household chemicals, no expensive equipment necessary, no hard-to-obtain precursors, just codeine pills, some iodine, red phosphorus scraped from matchbox striking pads, and a few other ingredients available at any hardware store. The recipe spread through Russian drug communities with terrifying speed. Users taught other users. The method appeared almost elegant in its simplicity compared to heroin's complex production chain. Addicts could manufacture their own supply without depending on dealers or international smuggling networks. The cost was absurdly low. $8 worth of ingredients produced enough desomorphine for several injections. Compare that to the $150 gram of heroin, and the appeal became obvious. Russia's addict population saw salvation in a syringe they could fill themselves. They called it Krokodil, Russian slang for crocodile, though nobody agrees on exactly why. Some say the name came from the alpha-chlorokidide intermediate used in synthesis. Others claim it referred to the scaly, green-grey skin lesions that appeared at injection sites. The most disturbing theory suggests users themselves resembled crocodiles after their skin transformed into reptilian patches of necrotic tissue. Whatever the etymology, the name stuck. Krokodil began its rampage through Russia's most impoverished regions during the mid-2000s. Users discovered the high felt nearly identical to heroin, perhaps even more intense due to desomorphine's greater potency. The euphoria arrived within seconds of injection. Problems emerged just as fast. Injection sites turned colours within hours, progressing from red to purple to greenish-grey. The skin became scaly and hard, genuinely resembling crocodile hide. Users noticed but didn't care much initially. Heroin caused track marks and bruising too. This seemed like a cosmetic issue, ugly but manageable. They were catastrophically wrong. The discoloration was actually the first visible sign of massive tissue death occurring beneath the skin. The street synthesis of desomorphine created something very different from pharmaceutical permanid. Lyndon Small had synthesized pure desomorphine in a proper laboratory with reagent-grade chemicals and careful purification. Roche manufactured Permanid under pharmaceutical standards with rigorous quality control. The Russian street version contained disomorphine, yes, but also a nightmarish soup of toxic contaminants. The backyard chemists used gasoline or lighter fluid as solvents. They added hydrochloric acid without neutralizing it afterward. They scraped red phosphorus from matchboxes, bringing along all the glue and other chemicals mixed into the striking pad. They used iodine from veterinary suppliers or photography shops, often contaminated with stabilizers and additives. Most critically, they skipped purification steps entirely. Laboratory synthesis includes multiple washing and filtering stages to remove unwanted byproducts. Street cooks either didn't know about purification or couldn't be bothered. The final product was brown or greenish sludge that users drew into syringes and injected directly into their veins. This toxic mixture contained heavy metals like lead and cadmium from the phosphorus. It held residual solvents that killed cells on contact. The acids remained active, burning through tissue like chemical weapons. Worst of all, the disomorphine itself crystallized inside veins because it was never properly dissolved. These microscopic crystals acted like glass shards, shredding blood vessels from the inside and triggering massive inflammatory responses. The human body cannot process industrial solvents and heavy metals efficiently. These substances accumulated in tissues, poisoning cells and destroying the microcirculation that keeps flesh alive. Blood vessels collapsed. Oxygen stopped reaching surrounding tissue. Without oxygen, cells died. Dead tissue turned black. Bacterial infection set in. The necrosis spread outward from injection sites like wildfire through dry grass. Pharmaceutical desomorphine, when administered properly, was relatively safe. Patients in Swiss hospitals use Permanid for decades without their arms rotting off. The chemical structure of disomorphine itself doesn't cause tissue death. The drug metabolizes in the liver like other opioids, processes through the kidneys, and exits the body. What killed Krokodil users wasn't the disomorphine. It was everything else in the injection, the gasoline and acid and metal particles that accompanied the drug into bloodstreams. The tragedy is that users were poisoning themselves with industrial waste while chasing a high from a compound that could have been safe in pure form. They were injecting paint thinner to feel the effects of a pharmaceutical that once sold in legitimate pharmacies. Russian addicts had unwittingly transformed a medical compound into a flesh-eating nightmare through nothing more than poverty, desperation, and catastrophically inadequate chemistry. By 2005, Krokodil had established itself in Siberian cities and was spreading westward. Users in Irkutsk, Tver, and Nizhny Novgorod began showing up at hospitals with horrifying wounds. Doctors had never seen anything like it. The necrosis was too rapid, too extensive, too resistant to treatment. Standard wound care protocols failed completely. Antibiotics barely slowed the infections. Surgical debridement removed dead tissue, but new areas died faster than surgeons could cut. Emergency room physicians began encountering patients with exposed bone where skin and muscle should have been, yet these patients were still alive, still conscious, still begging for help. The medical community realized they were facing something unprecedented. This wasn't just another drug epidemic. This was a chemical weapon that users were voluntarily injecting into themselves multiple times per day, every single day, until their bodies collapsed completely. The recipe for Krokodil reads like instructions for building a bomb rather than manufacturing medicine. Start with codeine tablets, the kind Russian pharmacies sold without prescription for headaches and minor pain. Users needed anywhere from 10 to 30 pills depending on strength, crushed into powder using the back of a spoon or a coffee grinder. Add this powder to a container, usually a plastic bottle or glass jar. Pour in gasoline or paint thinner as the primary solvent, enough to dissolve the codeine completely. The mixture already looked poisonous at this stage, a murky solution that would make any rational person hesitate. Addicts didn't hesitate. They were just getting started. Red phosphorus came next, scraped from the striking pads of matchboxes. Users needed multiple boxes, sometimes dozens, sitting with razors or knives to collect the reddish-brown material. This step alone took hours of tedious work. The phosphorus mixed with iodine created the key reaction that converted codeine into desomorphine. Finding iodine presented its own challenges. Some users bought it from veterinary suppliers who sold it for livestock treatments. Others raided photography shops that stocked iodine for developing solutions. The clever ones discovered that certain water purification tablets contained iodine and could be dissolved. Everything went into the container together: codeine, gasoline, phosphorus, iodine. The chemical cocktail already contained enough toxins to cause serious organ damage, and the cooking process hadn't even begun. Hydrochloric acid joined the mixture, usually drain cleaner or toilet bowl cleaner with high acid concentration. This triggered violent reactions. The container heated up rapidly, sometimes too hot to hold. Toxic fumes billowed from the mixture, releasing iodine vapor that stained everything nearby a distinctive yellow-brown color. Users cooked Krokodil in bathrooms, kitchens, garages, anywhere with minimal ventilation because the smell was overwhelming. Neighbors often reported suspicious chemical odors, but rarely understood what they were smelling. The acid reacted with phosphorus and iodine to strip oxygen atoms from the codeine molecule. The same basic process Lyndon Small had performed in 1932 with reagent-grade chemicals and proper laboratory equipment. Street chemists accomplished the identical transformation, using hardware store ingredients and zero safety protocols. The mixture boiled and bubbled for 30 minutes to several hours, depending on whose recipe the cook followed. Some added gasoline multiple times to keep the reaction going. Others included additional mystery ingredients they swore improved potency: crushed light bulbs for extra phosphorus, battery acid for stronger reactions, cleaning products with ammonia. Each cook developed personal variations, trading tips like chefs sharing recipes, except these recipes destroyed human tissue with ruthless efficiency. The final step involved filtering the brown sludge through cloth or cotton to remove solid particles. Many users skipped even this basic filtration. They simply drew the liquid directly into syringes, injecting themselves with whatever chemical soup resulted from the process. The mathematics of addiction made Krokodil irresistible despite the obvious dangers. Heroin cost $150 per gram in Russia by 2005, and that single gram provided perhaps 4 to 6 doses for an experienced user. An addict needed at minimum $30 to $50 daily to avoid withdrawal, often much more as tolerance built. Most users spent $100 or more per day maintaining their habit. Annual costs exceeded $30,000, an impossible sum for unemployed factory workers in collapsed industrial towns. Krokodil required only $8 in ingredients to produce a day's supply. The savings were staggering, a 94% reduction in cost compared to heroin. But the high lasted only 90 minutes at most, sometimes as little as 45 minutes for regular users. Heroin's effects persisted for 4 to 8 hours, allowing addicts some breathing room between doses. Krokodil users faced a brutal schedule: inject, experience 90 minutes of relief, then descend into withdrawal so severe it felt like bones were breaking from the inside. The only solution was another injection, then another 90 minutes later, then again. Users found themselves injecting 10 to 15 times every single day just to stay functional. The brief duration meant they were essentially chained to their drug supply, unable to hold jobs or maintain normal routines, because they needed to cook and inject every hour and a half. We hope you have already subscribed to our channel, and if not, please do so right now. Our goal is to reach our first 1,000 subscribers. This is very important to us. Only on our channel will you find such interesting and unique stories about drugs. Subscribe so you don't miss them, and we'll get back to the story. The chemistry behind Krokodil's tissue destruction was brutally simple. The toxic compounds in street desomorphine had multiple mechanisms for killing flesh. Heavy metals like lead accumulated in small blood vessels, blocking circulation to surrounding tissue. Residual solvents dissolved cell membranes on contact, causing immediate death of any cells they touched. The acids that remained from synthesis ate through vessel walls like acid through fabric. Most destructively, the impure desomorphine crystallized inside veins because it wasn't properly dissolved. These microscopic crystals were sharp enough to physically shred the endothelial lining of blood vessels, the delicate single-cell layer that keeps blood flowing smoothly. When vessel linings got damaged, the body's clotting mechanisms activated. Blood clots formed rapidly at injury sites, attempting to seal the damage. These clots blocked blood flow to entire sections of tissue. Without blood, cells starved for oxygen within minutes. The medical term is ischemia, tissue death from lack of blood supply. Ischemia triggers a cascade of cellular destruction. Cells switch to anaerobic metabolism, producing lactic acid that further damages surrounding tissue. Immune cells rush to the area, releasing inflammatory chemicals. These inflammatory signals attract more immune cells in a vicious cycle. Eventually, massive sections of tissue die simultaneously, rotting while still inside the living body. The infection component made everything exponentially worse. Dead tissue is sterile initially, but bacteria colonize it within hours. Krokodil injection sites provided perfect environments for bacterial growth. Dead flesh for food, warmth from body heat, and moisture from tissue fluid. Staphylococcus and streptococcus bacteria moved in first, the same organisms that cause minor skin infections normally. But in the presence of massive tissue death, these bacteria multiplied wildly. They released toxins that killed even more cells, expanding the zone of necrosis. Deeper infections brought anaerobic bacteria like Clostridium, which thrive in oxygen-starved tissue. Clostridium produces gas as a metabolic byproduct, creating pockets of foul-smelling gas under the skin. Doctors could literally hear crackling sounds when pressing on infected areas, gas bubbles popping under their fingers. Users kept injecting despite watching their bodies rot. This wasn't ignorance or stupidity. Desomorphine creates severe physical dependency within days of first use. The withdrawal syndrome rivals or exceeds heroin withdrawal in intensity. Muscles cramp violently, bones ache as if breaking, nausea and vomiting continue for days, and a profound dysphoria makes addicts feel like death would be preferable to consciousness. Facing this horror every 90 minutes created a level of desperation that overrode all survival instinct. Users watched green scales form on their arms and knew something terrible was happening. They saw the skin blacken and harden. They smelled the rot. None of it mattered because withdrawal felt worse than tissue death, at least in the immediate moment. The injection site selection became progressively more desperate as veins collapsed. Users started with the inner elbow, the classic location for intravenous drug use. Those veins died within weeks. They moved to the forearm, finding smaller vessels. Those collapsed too. The back of the hand still had veins, then the feet and ankles. The legs offered larger vessels that survived slightly longer. Some users injected into their necks, hitting the jugular vein directly because no peripheral veins remained functional. Others found the femoral vein in the groin, one of the largest vessels in the body. The most desperate injected wherever they could see even the faintest blue line under their skin, hoping to hit something that would carry the drug to their brain. Each injection killed more tissue and destroyed more veins. The necrotic areas spread outward from every injection site like burn wounds expanding. Users developed dozens of these wounds simultaneously as they rotated through body parts searching for viable veins. Arms resembled battlefields, cratered with necrotic ulcers and patches of blackened skin. Legs looked worse. The tissue damage followed blood flow patterns, creating distinctive streaks of dead flesh radiating from injection points. Medical professionals could identify Krokodil users at a glance by these characteristic wound patterns, unlike anything seen with other drugs. The phosphorus component added its own unique horror. Red phosphorus itself is relatively stable, but the synthesis process converted some into white phosphorus, a substance so reactive it ignites spontaneously in air. White phosphorus particles embedded in tissue continued reacting slowly, burning from the inside at low temperatures. This created additional zones of necrosis that appeared mysteriously distant from injection sites. Users sometimes developed wounds on parts of their body they had never injected, caused by phosphorus particles travelling through the bloodstream and lodging in capillary beds. The particles glowed faintly in darkness, giving infected wounds an eerie luminescence that terrified both users and medical staff. Iodine residue stained everything it contacted a distinctive yellow-brown colour. Heavy users showed this staining on skin, in veins visible through translucent areas, and even in their eyes as the sclera absorbed iodine from the bloodstream. The staining wasn't just cosmetic. Iodine in high concentrations is toxic to thyroid tissue, causing severe endocrine disruption. Many Krokodil users developed hyperthyroidism, their thyroid glands poisoned by repeated iodine exposure. This caused additional symptoms: extreme fatigue, weight gain despite malnutrition, depression that compounded the psychological effects of addiction. The body couldn't process this level of iodine exposure properly. It accumulated in tissues, causing damage everywhere it concentrated. Methamphetamine cooks faced DEA raids and potential prison time, but the cooking process itself wouldn't kill them. Krokodil synthesis was arguably more dangerous than making meth. The toxic fumes alone caused respiratory damage. Users who cooked in enclosed spaces without ventilation sometimes passed out from solvent exposure, waking hours later with chemical burns in their lungs. The hydrochloric acid splashed during mixing, causing skin burns and eye damage. Explosions were rare but possible when mixing certain chemicals. Iodine vapor exposure caused chronic respiratory problems even without acute incidents. People were poisoning themselves before they even injected the drug, breathing toxic fumes day after day as they cooked batch after batch. The preparation environment made contamination inevitable. Users cooked in dirty apartments, using unwashed containers and improvised equipment. Bacteria entered the mixture at every stage. The lack of sterilization meant each injection was potentially septic, even before considering the chemical toxicity. Hospital-prepared intravenous medications undergo extensive sterilization and quality testing. Street drugs have no quality control whatsoever. Krokodil represented the absolute bottom of drug purity, a toxic sludge containing not just the desired compound, but dozens of poisonous contaminants. Users were injecting industrial waste directly into their bloodstreams, expecting their bodies to somehow filter out everything except the desomorphine. The filtration step that some users included was tragically inadequate. Drawing the liquid through cotton or cloth removed only large particles. It did nothing for dissolved toxins, heavy metals, or acid residues. Some users believed cigarette filters provided sterilization, pushing their drug solution through tobacco filters before injection. This added tobacco particulates to the mixture without removing any chemical contaminants. Others used coffee filters or torn pieces of t-shirt. The most desperate used nothing, injecting raw, unfiltered solution. Every method failed to address the fundamental problem. The drug itself was poison, and no amount of filtration would make it safe. The economic trap closed completely once users began injecting Krokodil regularly. The damaged veins and infected tissues required medical treatment that cost far more than the money saved on drugs. Hospital stays, surgeries, antibiotics, wound care supplies, the medical expenses dwarfed heroin costs. But addicts couldn't access this care anyway. Russian healthcare was collapsing under post-Soviet economic stress. Hospitals turned away drug users, viewing them as self-inflicted cases unworthy of scarce resources. Even when admitted, users left against medical advice to get their next fix, sometimes walking out mid-surgery. The supposed economic advantage of Krokodil evaporated instantly when viewed across any reasonable time frame. Users saved $8 per day while destroying their bodies so thoroughly they would need hundreds of thousands of dollars in medical care they would never receive. The first documented Krokodil cases emerged in 2002 from industrial cities scattered across Siberia's frozen expanse. Irkutsk reported clusters of patients with identical necrotic wounds, tissue damage unlike anything local physicians had encountered. Doctors initially suspected necrotizing fasciitis, the flesh-eating bacterial infection that kills within days. But antibiotics that should have stopped bacterial spread did nothing. The wounds continued expanding regardless of treatment. Patients kept arriving with the same horrifying presentation: greenish skin, exposed muscle, bones visible through rotting flesh. Medical staff realized they were seeing something new, though they didn't yet know what caused it. Tomsk documented its first cases the same year, followed by Omsk and Novosibirsk. The pattern matched perfectly across cities. Young men in their 20s and 30s, all with histories of opioid addiction, all presenting with rapidly progressing tissue necrosis. The geographic distribution told its own story. These weren't random occurrences scattered nationwide. The cases concentrated in specific regions: Siberia's industrial heartland, where Soviet-era factories had employed hundreds of thousands before collapsing in the 1990s. Unemployment in these cities ranged from 30 to 45%. An entire generation of young men had grown up watching their fathers lose jobs and futures disappear. Heroin offered escape, but heroin was expensive. Something cheaper was spreading through these communities like wildfire through dead timber. By 2005, Krokodil had reached Russia's European territories. Tver Oblast reported its first cases, then Nizhny Novgorod, then regions surrounding Moscow itself. The drug followed the Trans-Siberian Railway westward, carried by users who shared the recipe with addicts in each new city. Drug culture operates through tight networks, where information spreads faster than official warnings. One user traveling from Irkutsk to Moscow could seed an entire epidemic simply by showing local addicts how to cook Krokodil. The recipe moved through prisons too, where inmates traded drug manufacturing knowledge like currency. Released prisoners brought the synthesis back to their home regions, starting new clusters of infection. Health officials tracked case numbers as they climbed exponentially. 2006 saw roughly 5,000 documented Krokodil users in Russia. 2007 doubled that figure. 2008 brought another doubling. The growth curve looked identical to viral pandemic spread, except this was a chemical epidemic with no natural immunity and no possibility of vaccination. By 2010, estimates placed Russian Krokodil users at over 100,000, though the real number was certainly higher. Many addicts never sought medical care, dying alone in apartments or on the streets. Others received treatment for infections without doctors realizing Krokodil caused the underlying damage. The true scale of the epidemic remained hidden beneath inadequate surveillance systems. Regional hotspots developed where Krokodil use reached catastrophic levels. Certain neighborhoods in Yekaterinburg saw 30 to 40% of young men using the drug. Small industrial towns like Magnitogorsk reported that 20% of hospital admissions involved Krokodil-related complications. Emergency rooms in Siberian cities treated more Krokodil wounds than traffic accidents or heart attacks. The healthcare system was already strained from decades of underfunding and post-Soviet collapse. Krokodil pushed it past the breaking point. Hospitals ran out of antibiotics and surgical supplies. Doctors worked 70-hour weeks trying to manage the influx of rotting addicts. Waiting rooms filled with people whose flesh was literally falling off their bones. The social conditions that enabled Krokodil's spread created perfect storm circumstances. Putin-era Russia saw explosive economic growth for Moscow and St. Petersburg. But the industrial regions that fueled Krokodil's rise saw nothing. Wealth concentrated in cities while former manufacturing centers decayed. Young men in places like Irkutsk and Tver had unemployment rates that exceeded Great Depression levels. The jobs that did exist paid barely enough for food and rent, certainly not enough to support families or build futures. Heroin offered temporary oblivion from this reality, but at prices that quickly consumed any available money. Krokodil arrived as the poor man's heroin, and the poor had nothing left to lose. Russia's healthcare infrastructure had essentially abandoned addiction treatment by the mid-2000s. State-funded rehabilitation centers closed during the 1990s economic crisis and never reopened. Private treatment remained available in major cities but cost more than a year's wages for working-class families. The few public programs that existed operated with minimal budgets and waiting lists, stretching months or years. Methadone maintenance therapy, the gold standard for opioid addiction treatment, was completely illegal in Russia. The government viewed methadone as simply replacing one addiction with another, ignoring decades of evidence showing it saved lives and helped users recover. This policy left addicts with only one option: quit cold turkey and suffer through withdrawal that felt like death, or keep using. Heroin supply disruptions accelerated Krokodil's spread. Russian border guards increased enforcement after 2005, seizing larger shipments from Afghanistan and Central Asia. The crackdown succeeded in reducing heroin availability, but did nothing to reduce demand. Basic economics took over. Restricted supply meant higher prices. A gram that cost $50 in 2000 reached $150 by 2008 in many regions. Addicts faced an impossible choice between agonizing withdrawal and financial ruin. When Krokodil appeared offering essentially the same high for $8, the decision made itself. Health consequences seemed abstract and distant compared to immediate withdrawal symptoms. The geographic spread followed predictable patterns once researchers mapped it retrospectively. Cities along major rail lines got infected first as users travelled between regions. From those initial nodes, Krokodil radiated outward to smaller surrounding towns and rural areas. The Trans-Siberian Railway acted as the epidemic's main artery, pumping infected knowledge westward across Russia's vast territory. Secondary spread occurred through family connections, friends in different cities, and released prisoners returning home. By 2009, virtually every major Russian city had documented Krokodil cases. The drug had conquered a nation of 140 million people in less than 7 years. International alarms began sounding as cases appeared beyond Russia's borders. Ukraine reported its first Krokodil users in 2008, concentrated in eastern regions with close cultural and economic ties to Russia. The synthesis spread through similar channels: poor industrial areas, high unemployment, existing heroin addiction, and pharmacy access to codeine. Kazakhstan documented cases in 2009, particularly in cities near the Russian border. Georgia found Krokodil users in 2010. The drug was escaping Russia's boundaries, following post-Soviet migration patterns and drug trafficking routes across borders that remained porous despite official controls. Western Europe encountered its first cases in 2011. Germany reported several users, mostly immigrants from former Soviet states who brought the recipe with them. Poland documented a handful of cases. The United Kingdom's National Health Service issued warnings after treating 2 patients with crocodile-related necrosis. These cases remained rare in Western Europe, but their mere existence terrified public health officials. If crocodile gained a foothold in countries with larger opioid-addicted populations, the consequences could be catastrophic. The United States had millions of prescription opioid users who might seek cheaper alternatives as regulations tightened. European countries had substantial heroin-using populations in major cities. The potential was there for crocodile to become a global pandemic. The American case in 2013 generated massive media coverage disproportionate to the actual threat. Banner, Arizona, a town of 3,500 people, reported a patient with tissue necrosis consistent with crocodile use. American media seized on the story with sensationalist fervour. Cable news ran segments with titles like "Zombie Drug Hits America" and "Flesh-Eating Epidemic Reaches US." Shores. The coverage was technically accurate but wildly misleading in scale. This was one patient in a remote Arizona town, not an epidemic. No other confirmed American crocodile cases followed, suggesting the drug never gained traction in the United States, but the media hysteria had already achieved maximum viral spread. The sensationalist coverage actually obscured the real tragedy. American news outlets focused on crocodile as a curiosity, a horrifying exotic drug from foreign lands rather than a symptom of systemic failures in addiction treatment and economic opportunity. Russian users became props in shock journalism designed to drive clicks and ratings. The graphic images of rotting limbs circulated on social media as trauma porn, divorced from context about why desperate people would inject gasoline-based sludge into their veins. The human beings suffering from crocodile addiction became objects of morbid fascination, rather than subjects deserving compassion and help. Russian authorities responded slowly and inadequately to the mounting crisis. Local health departments documented cases and reported upward to regional administrators, who filed reports with federal health agencies where the information vanished into bureaucratic black holes. Coordination between agencies barely existed. The Federal Drug Control Service focused on law enforcement rather than public health. The Ministry of Health had no budget for addiction treatment expansion. Regional governments lacked authority to implement meaningful interventions. This fragmentation allowed the epidemic to grow unchecked for nearly a decade before any effective response materialized. The pharmaceutical lobby resisted the one intervention that could have stopped crocodile immediately, restricting over-the-counter codeine sales. Manufacturers argued that millions of Russians used codeine legitimately for headaches, menstrual cramps, and minor pain. Requiring prescriptions would burden doctors, inconvenience patients, and reduce pharmaceutical sales. The economic argument carried weight in a system where corruption was standard and industry lobbyists wielded significant influence. Politicians accepted the pharmaceutical industry's position that restricting codeine would harm more people than it helped. This decision cost thousands of lives as crocodile continued spreading unimpeded. Police arrested users and small-time dealers, but never disrupted crocodile's spread because the production model was decentralized. Unlike heroin, which required international smuggling networks and centralized processing facilities, Krokodil was manufactured by individual users in their own homes. There was no kingpin to arrest, no cartel to dismantle, no smuggling route to interdict. Every user was their own manufacturer. Arresting one person simply meant one less user, not disruption of supply chains. The police tactics that worked against traditional drug trafficking were completely ineffective against a drug that anyone could make in their kitchen. By 2012, Russia had become home to the world's most severe drug epidemic in terms of visible physical devastation. Other countries had higher overdose death rates. America's opioid crisis killed more people annually. But no drug created the visceral horror of Krokodil's flesh-eating necrosis. Hospital wards filled with patients who looked like victims of chemical warfare or medieval plague. The young men dying from Krokodil didn't simply overdose and stop breathing. They rotted alive over months or years, enduring unimaginable pain and disfigurement before succumbing to sepsis or organ failure. The psychological impact on families and communities was immeasurable. International organizations finally mobilized as the scale became undeniable. The World Health Organization published reports on Krokodil, though their recommendations remained vague and inadequately funded. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime added desomorphine to monitoring programs. NGOs working in addiction treatment sounded increasingly desperate alarms. But international pressure meant little when Russian domestic policy remained unchanged. The government continued refusing to legalize methadone or fund comprehensive addiction treatment. Codeine stayed available over the counter. The conditions that created the epidemic persisted. The one factor that might have limited Krokodil's international spread was its very horror. Users in Western countries with better drug availability had options that didn't involve injecting gasoline and acid. Why choose Krokodil when pharmaceutical opioids or even heroin were accessible? The drug only made economic sense in places where poverty was so extreme that $8 versus $150 meant the difference between using and being sick. Western addicts might be desperate, but most weren't so destitute they needed to manufacture their own drugs from hardware store chemicals. Krokodil remained largely confined to the former Soviet Union because only there did the economic and social conditions create sufficient desperation. The epidemic's trajectory by 2012 pointed toward total catastrophe without intervention. Usage rates were still climbing exponentially in affected regions. Each generation of users recruited the next by sharing recipes and techniques. The average age of first-time users was dropping as teenagers watched older siblings and friends use Krokodil and decided to try it themselves. Some cities faced the prospect of losing entire age cohorts to a drug that killed 90% of users within 3 years. Russia was experiencing slow-motion genocide of its working-class youth, and the government's response remained inadequate, bordering on non-existent. The injection process began the body's destruction within seconds. The toxic mixture entered the vein and immediately started chemical warfare against surrounding tissue. Blood vessels that carried Krokodil toward the heart suffered the first assault. The acidic solution burned through vessel walls like acid through paper. Hydrochloric acid residues in the mixture ate away the delicate endothelial cells lining veins, creating raw wounds inside the circulatory system. These wounds triggered massive inflammation as the immune system recognized catastrophic damage and flooded the area with white blood cells. The desomorphine crystals acted as microscopic weapons tearing through tissue. Improperly dissolved, these crystals maintained sharp edges that shredded everything they contacted. Blood cells burst as crystals punctured their membranes. Vessel walls developed tears and holes. The crystals lodged in small capillaries, blocking blood flow to entire sections of tissue downstream. Each injection deposited thousands of these microscopic daggers throughout the injection site. creating a zone of mechanical destruction that compounded the chemical damage. The combination was more devastating than either mechanism alone. Within the first hour, users noticed the injection site changing colour. The skin turned reddish-purple as blood leaked from damaged capillaries into surrounding tissue. This wasn't the normal bruising from needle insertion. The discoloration spread rapidly, covering areas the size of a hand within 60 minutes. The purple deepened to dark burgundy as more blood accumulated. Swelling followed as tissue fluid leaked from compromised vessels. The injection site became hot to touch, inflamed tissue radiating heat like a fresh burn. Users felt throbbing pain that intensified steadily, though the drug's euphoria initially masked this warning signal. By hour 6, the skin started developing its characteristic scaly texture. The epidermis hardened as cells died and dehydrated. The texture resembled dried leather or reptile skin, rough and inflexible. The colour shifted from purple to greenish-grey, an unnatural hue caused by hemoglobin breaking down in oxygen-starved tissue. This was the transformation that gave Krokodil its name. Users watched their skin literally transform into something non-human, reptilian scales spreading from the injection point outward in concentric rings. The scales cracked when users moved the affected limb, revealing raw tissue underneath. The necrosis accelerated dramatically between days 2 and 4. What began as surface-level damage penetrated deeper into muscle and connective tissue. Blood flow to the area had essentially stopped as thrombosis blocked vessels, and inflammation compressed remaining open channels. Without oxygen, cells switched to anaerobic metabolism, producing lactic acid as a byproduct. This acid further damaged nearby cells in a vicious cascade. Cell membranes broke down, releasing enzymes that digested surrounding tissue. The process was autocatalytic, dead cells releasing chemicals that killed more cells, which released more chemicals. Within 1 week, muscle tissue began visible decomposition. The flesh turned black as cells died en masse. The blackened areas felt hard and cold, completely different from healthy tissue. Users could press on these zones without feeling pain because the nerve endings had necrotized along with everything else. The loss of sensation was deceptive. It suggested healing when actually it indicated total tissue death. Doctors could identify necrotic tissue by its appearance and temperature. Black or dark green, cold to touch, and emitting the distinctive smell of rotting flesh that anyone who encountered it remembered forever. The bacterial invasion began around day 3 or 4. Dead tissue is sterile initially, but bacteria colonize it rapidly once they arrive. Staphylococcus aureus moved in first, the same bacteria that cause minor skin infections normally. In the presence of massive necrotic tissue, these organisms multiplied at exponential rates. Each bacterium divided every 20 minutes under ideal conditions, and dead flesh provided ideal conditions. Within hours, millions became billions. The bacteria released toxins as metabolic waste, chemicals that killed surrounding healthy tissue and expanded the infection's reach. The zone of necrosis grew larger every day. Streptococcus pyogenes joined the bacterial assault, bringing its own arsenal of tissue-destroying enzymes. This species produces streptokinase, an enzyme that dissolves blood clots, ironically preventing the body's attempts to wall off infected areas. It also secretes hyaluronidase, which breaks down connective tissue and allows bacteria to spread deeper. The combination of staph and strep created synergistic destruction, where each species enhanced the other's damage. Medical terms like polymicrobial necrotizing soft tissue infection barely captured the reality of what was happening. Multiple species of bacteria engaged in cooperative consumption of living human bodies. Deeper infections brought anaerobic bacteria that thrive without oxygen. Clostridium perfringens, the causative agent of gas gangrene, found perfect conditions in the oxygen-deprived necrotic tissue. This species produces alpha-toxin, one of the most potent tissue-destroying substances known to biology. The toxin breaks down cell membranes, literally dissolving flesh into liquid. Clostridium also generates gas as a metabolic byproduct, creating bubbles that accumulated under the skin. Patients developed crepitus, a crackling sensation when the area was touched, caused by gas bubbles popping under pressure. The gas made infected tissue spongy and caused hideous distension, swelling the affected area grotesquely. The smell became unbearable around day 7 to 10. Decomposing human tissue releases volatile organic compounds with distinctive odours, putrescine, cadaverine, and various sulfur-containing molecules. These are the same chemicals that make rotting corpses smell horrific, except Krokodil users produced these smells while still alive. The stench permeated everything: clothes, bedding, entire apartments. Family members couldn't stand being in the same room. The users themselves became desensitized to the smell, though it marked them clearly to everyone else. Medical staff could identify Krokodil patients before entering examination rooms simply from the odour. By week 2, bones became exposed as tissue rotted away completely. Tendons that normally stayed hidden beneath muscle, and skin appeared as white cords stretching across chasms of missing flesh. Bones showed as grey-white structures protruding through black necrotic tissue. These weren't clean surgical exposures, but ragged wounds where flesh had decomposed unevenly. Fragments of dead tissue hung from edges. The exposure didn't heal because the tissue damage was too extensive for the body's repair mechanisms to bridge. Users walked around with visible bones, their skeletal structure partially revealed while they still lived. Osteomyelitis developed in most cases where bone became exposed. Bacteria don't normally infect bone tissue because it is dense and relatively inaccessible. But Krokodil created direct pathways for bacterial invasion. Staphylococcus aureus particularly excels at bone infection, burrowing into the mineralized matrix and creating abscesses deep inside. Bone infections are nearly impossible to cure with antibiotics alone because medication penetrates bone poorly. The infection becomes chronic, causing ongoing bone destruction and releasing bacteria into the bloodstream periodically. Some users developed septic arthritis when infections reached joints, destroying cartilage and making movement agonizing. The infection spread through blood and lymphatic vessels to distant body parts. Users who injected only their arms sometimes developed infections in their legs, chest, or face. Bacteria entered the bloodstream during the initial infection and lodged wherever they found favourable conditions. Septic emboli, clumps of bacteria and infected material, travelled through circulation and created new infection sites wherever they landed. This meant users could develop multiple simultaneous zones of necrosis scattered across their bodies, each one representing a separate bacterial colony consuming flesh. Kidney failure emerged as a common complication from the toxic load. The kidneys filter blood constantly, removing waste products and toxins for excretion in urine. Krokodil's chemical cocktail overwhelmed this system completely. Heavy metals like lead and cadmium accumulated in kidney tubules, poisoning the cells that perform filtration. Myoglobin from destroyed muscle tissue flooded the bloodstream and clogged kidney filters, a condition called rhabdomyolysis. Bacterial toxins damaged kidney tissue directly. The combined assault frequently caused acute kidney failure, requiring dialysis if treatment was available. Without dialysis, waste products built up in the blood, causing uremia and eventual death. Liver damage occurred through similar mechanisms. The liver processes drugs and toxins, breaking them down into forms the body can eliminate. Desomorphine itself metabolizes in the liver like other opioids, a normal process that healthy livers handle easily. But the industrial solvents and chemical contaminants in Krokodil were different. Gasoline contains benzene and other aromatic hydrocarbons that the liver struggles to process. These compounds damage hepatocytes, the cells that perform liver functions. Chronic exposure caused fatty liver disease, hepatitis, and eventually cirrhosis. Users showed elevated liver enzymes in blood tests, indicating ongoing hepatocyte death. Some developed jaundice as the failing liver couldn't process bilirubin properly. The cardiovascular system took direct hits from endocarditis and pulmonary complications. Bacteria circulating in blood sometimes colonized heart valves, creating infected vegetations that interfered with normal valve function. These vegetations shed fragments that traveled to other organs, spreading infection throughout the body. The lungs suffered particularly because they received all blood returning from the body, acting as filters that trapped bacteria and emboli. Users developed multiple pulmonary abscesses, pockets of infection scattered throughout lung tissue. Breathing became laboured as functional lung capacity decreased. Many users developed pneumonia that antibiotics couldn't cure because the underlying immune compromise was too severe. The immune system collapsed under the constant assault. Fighting massive infections requires enormous resources: white blood cells, antibodies, inflammatory chemicals, and energy. The body diverted resources from other functions to fuel the immune response. But Krokodil users faced infections that couldn't be defeated, only temporarily contained. The immune system exhausted itself fighting losing battles against overwhelming bacterial loads. White blood cell counts that normally run 5 to 10,000 cells per microliter sometimes exceeded 50,000 as the body desperately tried to marshal defenses. This hyperactive immune state paradoxically made users more susceptible to other infections as resources depleted. Users continued injecting despite watching their bodies decompose. This defied rational comprehension for observers, but addiction operated on different logic. Desomorphine created profound physical dependence within days. The withdrawal syndrome was savage. Muscle cramps that felt like bones breaking, nausea and vomiting that lasted days, diarrhea that caused severe dehydration, and dysphoria so intense that death seemed preferable. Users faced this horror every 90 minutes as the short-acting drug wore off. The physical torture of withdrawal combined with psychological desperation created a compulsion that overrode survival instinct completely. The site rotation became increasingly desperate and grotesque. Initial injection sites destroyed within weeks became unusable. Veins collapsed and thrombosed. Users moved systematically through accessible veins, inner elbow first, then forearm, then back of hand. When arm veins failed, they tried feet and ankles. Leg veins lasted slightly longer because they were larger. The groin offered the femoral vein, one of the body's largest vessels. Neck injections targeted the jugular or external jugular veins. Some users injected into the subclavian vein beneath the collarbone. The most desperate tried the veins on top of the penis or in the tongue, anywhere blood vessels were visible or palpable. Each new injection site became another zone of necrosis, another spreading wound. Users developed dozens of these simultaneously, their bodies maps of destruction. Arms looked like charred wood, blackened and crumbling. Legs resembled mummies, desiccated tissue wrapped around bones. The torso showed scattered lesions where users had attempted increasingly creative injection locations. Face and neck injections created visible destruction that couldn't be hidden by clothing. These users became marked, their addiction and its consequences displayed for everyone to see. The social isolation that resulted was complete. The average survival time from first injection was 2 to 3 years. though the range varied wildly. Some users died within 6 months, succumbing to overwhelming sepsis or organ failure. Others survived 5 years through a combination of limited use, better injection technique, or pure chance. Very few made it past 5 years. The cause of death was rarely the desomorphin itself, which is survivable with appropriate medical support. Users died from infections, pneumonia, sepsis, endocarditis. They died from organ failure, kidney shutdown, liver failure, heart damage. They died from complications, pulmonary embolism, stroke, hemorrhage. Some died from suicide, choosing that escape over continued suffering. The pain management paradox was particularly cruel. Users were injecting an opioid, a class of drugs designed specifically for pain relief. Yet Krokodil caused pain so severe that even high doses of desomorphine couldn't control it. The tissue destruction generated pain signals that overwhelmed the drug's analgesic effects. Users felt every bit of their flesh rotting despite being under the influence of a powerful painkiller. They injected more frequently in hopeless attempts to stay ahead of the pain, but each injection created more tissue damage and more pain. The cycle was inescapable except through death. Russian hospitals first encountered Krokodil patients around 2003 and had no protocols for treating them. Emergency room doctors initially misdiagnosed the condition as necrotizing fasciitis, a flesh-eating bacterial infection that requires immediate surgical intervention. They performed emergency debridement, cutting away dead tissue to stop infection spread. The patient survived the surgery, left the hospital within days, and returned weeks later with even worse necrosis. Doctors realized they were treating symptoms rather than causes, but the underlying problem remained mysterious until toxicology reports revealed desomorphine and its toxic contaminants. The treatment challenge was multifaceted in ways no single medical specialty could address. Infectious disease specialists dealt with the bacterial complications but couldn't reverse the chemical tissue damage. Surgeons could remove dead tissue but couldn't restore blood flow to poisoned vessels. Addiction medicine doctors could address withdrawal but lacked medications since methadone was illegal in Russia. Toxicologists identified the contaminants but had no antidotes for gasoline, paint thinner, and heavy metal poisoning administered directly into bloodstreams. Each specialty saw one piece of an unsolvable puzzle. By the time users sought medical help, damage was typically irreversible. The average patient arrived at the hospital 3 to 6 months after starting Krokodil use. Those months had been spent injecting toxic chemicals dozens of times daily, accumulating tissue destruction that no medical intervention could repair. Necrosis had already penetrated through skin and fat into muscle. Bones often showed early signs of infection. The vascular system was so compromised that even if doctors cleared the infections, blood couldn't reach the damaged areas to support healing. The window for effective intervention had closed long before patients walked through hospital doors. Surgical debridement became the primary treatment despite its limitations. Surgeons cut away all visibly necrotic tissue, removing blackened skin, dead muscle, and infected fat. The goal was creating clean wounds with viable tissue at the edges that could potentially heal. But Krokodil damage didn't have clear boundaries. Tissue that appeared healthy during surgery often necrotized within days, as the chemical poisoning continued affecting circulation. Patients required multiple operations, each one removing more tissue as the necrosis spread. Some users underwent 10 or 15 debridement surgeries over several months, their bodies carved away piece by piece. Amputation became necessary when infections threatened life, or when tissue destruction made limbs non-functional. Removing an arm or leg was sometimes the only way to stop sepsis from killing the patient. But even amputation wasn't straightforward with Krokodil users. The compromised vascular system meant poor wound healing at amputation sites. Stumps developed necrosis, requiring revision surgeries that removed more limb length. Some patients needed multiple amputations, losing more of the limb with each surgery. The most severe cases required disarticulation at the shoulder or hip, removing the entire limb to get ahead of spreading infection. Skin grafts failed more often than they succeeded. Normal wound healing requires adequate blood supply to support new tissue growth. Krokodil users had destroyed their microcirculation, the network of tiny vessels that delivers oxygen and nutrients to skin. Surgeons harvested healthy skin from unaffected body areas and grafted it over wounds, but the grafts died from lack of blood supply. Split-thickness grafts failed. Full-thickness grafts failed. Even sophisticated flap procedures where surgeons transferred tissue with its own blood supply had poor success rates because the recipient site couldn't support vascular integration. Patients endured multiple failed grafting attempts, each one creating new donor site wounds without achieving coverage. Antibiotic therapy faced bacterial resistance and inadequate tissue penetration. Russian hospitals used broad-spectrum antibiotics like vancomycin and carbapenems, the heavy artillery of antibacterial medicine. These drugs worked initially, but bacteria adapted rapidly. Methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, MRSA, colonized wounds within weeks, resistant to standard antibiotics. Vancomycin-resistant Enterococcus, VRE, followed. Multi-drug-resistant Pseudomonas required antibiotic combinations with severe side effects. Worse, antibiotics couldn't reach bacteria deep in necrotic tissue where blood flow had stopped. The medication circulated in blood but never arrived at infection sites. Bacteria in these protected zones continued multiplying regardless of treatment. Intravenous antibiotic therapy required functioning veins, which Krokodil users lacked. Their peripheral veins were destroyed, thrombosed and scarred from repeated toxic injections. Central venous catheters offered an alternative, placing large IV lines into major vessels like the subclavian or internal jugular veins. But these catheters became infected almost immediately in patients with active bacteremia. The circulating bacteria colonized the catheter within hours, creating biofilms that antibiotics couldn't penetrate. Each catheter infection required removal and placement of a new line in a different vessel. Users ran out of viable catheter sites within weeks. Pain management presented impossible contradictions. Patients suffered excruciating pain from tissue destruction, bone infections, and nerve damage. Normally, doctors would prescribe opioid analgesics for pain this severe. But these patients were opioid addicts whose tolerance was so high that normal doses did nothing. Giving them enough opioids to control pain meant feeding their addiction. Refusing adequate pain medication meant condemning them to torture. Doctors faced ethical dilemmas with no good answers. Some prescribed high-dose opioids and dealt with the addiction concerns later. Others minimized opioids and watched patients suffer. Neither approach felt right. Hospital stays stretched into months for severe cases. Extended hospitalization in Russian medical facilities was an ordeal even without considering the underlying condition. Hospitals were chronically underfunded, often lacking basic supplies like clean linens and adequate food. Patients sometimes slept two to a bed when census exceeded capacity. Families brought supplies because hospitals couldn't provide them. The staff-to-patient ratios were dangerous, one nurse managing 20 or more patients during night shifts. Krokodil users required intensive wound care, frequent dressing changes, medication administration, and monitoring for complications. The healthcare system couldn't provide that level of care. Users regularly left the hospital against medical advice to get their next fix. The short duration of desomorphine's effects meant withdrawal symptoms began within 90 minutes of the last dose. Hospitalized patients could manage this temporarily through sheer willpower or if hospitals provided opioid substitution, which they rarely did. But after days of being sick, the cravings became overwhelming. Patients disconnected their IVs, removed their surgical drains, and walked out mid-treatment. Some left immediately post-surgery, still groggy from anesthesia. Others made it a few days before the compulsion won. They returned to the streets, cooked Krokodil in their apartments, and injected again. The readmission cycle was predictable and demoralizing for medical staff. A patient would arrive with severe necrosis, undergo surgery, start showing signs of recovery, then disappear. 2 weeks later, they would return with new infections and worse tissue damage. The pattern repeated until the patient died or stopped coming. Doctors performed the same surgeries on the same patients multiple times, knowing their work would be undone the moment the patient left. The futility destroyed morale. Many physicians refused to treat Krokodil users, arguing that resources shouldn't be wasted on people who wouldn't follow treatment plans. Ethical debates raged about whether self-inflicted conditions deserved the same care as accidental injuries or disease. Financial constraints made comprehensive treatment impossible even for willing patients. Russian hospitals operated on shoestring budgets that couldn't accommodate the extended stays and multiple surgeries Krokodil patients required. A single complicated case could cost hundreds of thousands of dollars in surgery, antibiotics, wound care supplies, and hospitalization. State insurance covered only basic care. Families faced catastrophic medical bills for anything beyond standard treatment. Most couldn't pay, leaving hospitals to absorb the costs. This created perverse incentives where hospitals limited treatment for financial reasons rather than medical ones. Detoxification was even more challenging than treating physical wounds. Desomorphine withdrawal rivaled or exceeded heroin withdrawal in severity. Users experienced muscle cramps so intense they screamed continuously. Vomiting and diarrhea caused dangerous dehydration and electrolyte imbalances. The psychological component was devastating. Profound depression, anxiety, and cravings that felt like dying slowly. Standard detox protocols used decreasing doses of opioids to ease withdrawal, but this approach required days or weeks in a controlled setting. Russian addiction treatment facilities were scarce, and the few that existed had long waiting lists and substantial costs. Methadone maintenance, the gold standard for opioid addiction treatment, was completely illegal in Russia until 2020. International medical consensus held that methadone substitution allowed addicts to stabilize their lives while avoiding withdrawal and drug-seeking behavior. Dozens of studies proved its effectiveness, but Russian policy viewed methadone as simply replacing one addiction with another, ignoring evidence that maintenance therapy saved lives and facilitated recovery. This ideological position denied Krokodil users access to the most effective treatment available. They faced a binary choice: quit cold turkey and suffer unbearable withdrawal, or continue using until death. Rehabilitation programs existed but were inadequately funded and poorly designed. The few government-run facilities operated more like prisons than treatment centers, enforcing sobriety through isolation and harsh discipline. Private rehabs charged fees equivalent to annual salaries for working-class families. Both approaches had abysmal success rates under 5% for long-term sobriety. The programs rarely addressed the underlying factors that drove addiction: poverty, unemployment, trauma, and hopelessness. They treated addiction as a moral failing rather than a complex medical condition requiring comprehensive support. Users who completed programs returned to the same circumstances that created their addiction initially. Psychological treatment was almost non-existent. Most Krokodil users suffered from depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder, in addition to their addiction and physical injuries. These mental health conditions required therapy and potentially psychiatric medication to address effectively. But Russian healthcare provided minimal mental health services even for non-addicts. Psychiatrists were in short supply, concentrated in major cities, and rarely specialized in addiction medicine. Therapy remained expensive and stigmatized. Most users never received any psychological evaluation, let alone treatment for mental health conditions that perpetuated their addiction. The few users who achieved sobriety faced permanent disabilities that destroyed their futures. Krokodil left survivors with non-functional limbs even when amputation wasn't necessary. The destroyed veins meant chronic circulation problems, legs that swelled painfully, arms that couldn't maintain temperature properly, and constant susceptibility to infection from minor wounds. Nerve damage caused chronic pain that required long-term medication. The scarring and tissue loss created cosmetic disfigurement that made employment nearly impossible. Who would hire someone with exposed bones and rotting flesh, even if they were sober? The physical consequences ensured that users remained marginalized even if they managed to quit. Prosthetic limbs for amputees were luxury items most users couldn't access. The Russian healthcare system provided basic prosthetics, poorly fitted and uncomfortable devices that barely functioned. Advanced prosthetics with natural movement and sensory feedback cost tens of thousands of dollars, completely unaffordable. Many amputees simply lived without prosthetics, navigating life with missing limbs. This severely limited employment options, reduced mobility, and compounded the social isolation they already experienced. They had survived Krokodil only to face decades of disability and poverty. Chronic pain management became a lifelong challenge for survivors. The tissue destruction and bone infections created pain that persisted years after stopping drug use. This pain was severe enough to require ongoing medication, but prescribing opioids to recovering addicts risked relapse. Doctors tried non-opioid alternatives, NSAIDs, gabapentin, tricyclic antidepressants, and topical treatments. These helped somewhat, but rarely provided adequate relief. Survivors often lived in constant pain, unable to access effective medication because of their history. The choice was between suffering daily or risking addiction to pain medications. Immune system damage persisted long after the last injection. The constant infections and massive immune activation during active use left users with depleted immune function. They caught common infections easily: colds that became pneumonia, minor cuts that turned into serious infections, seasonal illnesses that required hospitalization. The immune compromise sometimes improved with years of abstinence and proper nutrition, but many survivors had permanently weakened defenses. They required careful monitoring and rapid treatment of any infection to prevent complications. The success rate for Krokodil addiction treatment was so low that many healthcare providers considered it essentially untreatable. Less than 5% of users who attempted to quit remained abstinent for more than 1 year. The physical dependency was too severe, the withdrawal too agonizing, the psychological compulsion too powerful, and the underlying life circumstances too unchanged. Users tried to quit repeatedly, suffering through withdrawal multiple times before relapsing. Each failed attempt reinforced the sense that escape was impossible, that Krokodil had them permanently. This learned helplessness made subsequent quit attempts even less likely to succeed. The typical Krokodil user profile emerged from epidemiological studies conducted between 2008 and 2012. Males comprised roughly 85% of users, overwhelmingly between ages 20 and 35. This demographic had come of age during Russia's catastrophic economic transition, watching the Soviet system collapse without any viable replacement emerging. Their fathers had worked in factories that closed permanently. Their mothers struggled with multiple low-wage jobs to keep families fed. These young men inherited nothing except broken social structures and landscapes of industrial decay. The geographic concentration told a story of economic devastation. Krokodil hotspots matched perfectly with regions hit hardest by deindustrialization. Magnitogorsk had been a steel production center employing 50,000 workers at its peak. By 2005, employment had dropped to 12,000 with wages barely covering rent. Irkutsk's aluminum plants closed or reduced operations to skeleton crews. Tver's chemical factories shut down after losing state subsidies. These cities transformed into economic dead zones where young men faced unemployment rates exceeding 40% with no prospects for improvement. The path to Krokodil usually began with legitimate pain. Factory injuries, construction accidents, or car crashes left workers with chronic pain conditions. Doctors prescribed codeine or tramadol for pain management, starting a dependency that felt medical rather than recreational initially. When prescriptions ran out, users discovered codeine was available over the counter and began self-medicating. The progression from pain management to addiction happened gradually, almost imperceptibly. They weren't seeking euphoria, but simply trying to function through daily pain that healthcare system had abandoned. Heroin entered the picture when codeine stopped working. Tolerance built rapidly, requiring higher doses that became expensive even at pharmacy prices. Someone in their social circle introduced heroin as a more effective alternative. The stigma against heroin was real, but not enough to overcome the practical problem. Codeine wasn't controlling their pain or satisfying their dependency anymore. Heroin worked immediately and completely. The euphoria was a bonus. Users convinced themselves they could maintain controlled use, that they were different from street addicts they despised. This delusion lasted weeks or months before addiction's reality became undeniable. The heroin prices climbed throughout the late 2000s as Russian authorities tightened borders. Users watched their daily cost rise from $30 to $50, then to $100 and beyond. Some tried limiting their use to maintain affordability, but opioid withdrawal made that approach torture. They spent every available ruble on heroin, pawning possessions, stealing from family, taking loans they couldn't repay. The drug consumed all resources while providing decreasing satisfaction as tolerance built. They were trapped in a cycle where stopping meant agony but continuing meant financial ruin. Krokodil arrived as salvation disguised as damnation. Someone they knew mentioned a way to make homemade heroin for almost nothing. The recipe circulated on paper scraps, shared in whispers, treated like contraband even though it wasn't technically illegal yet. The first batch seemed like a miracle. $8 in ingredients produced a high essentially identical to heroin. The 90-minute duration was inconvenient but manageable. Users thought they had discovered the solution to their financial problems. They could maintain their addiction without destroying their families economically. The initial injection sites healed slowly, but nothing alarming appeared immediately. The denial phase lasted weeks or sometimes months. The injection sites developed unusual discoloration. Yes, but heroin caused bruising too. The scaly texture was odd, but maybe just a reaction to impurities that would resolve with time. They rationalized every warning sign because acknowledging the truth meant admitting they were injecting gasoline into their veins. The human capacity for self-deception is remarkable when the alternative means facing unbearable withdrawal. They told themselves it wasn't that bad, that they would stop soon, that they just needed to get through this difficult period. The point of no return arrived when visible tissue damage made denial impossible. The skin turned genuinely reptilian, scales hardening into armor that cracked when they moved. The color shifted to greenish black, an inhuman shade that couldn't be explained away. The smell of rot became noticeable to others. Family members reacted with horror, friends distanced themselves, strangers stared openly. Users realized they had made a catastrophic mistake, but the physical dependency was already absolute. Stopping meant withdrawal so severe they couldn't function. Continuing meant watching their bodies decompose. There were no good choices remaining. Most users were estranged from family by this point. Parents couldn't handle watching their children rot alive and chose emotional distance as self-protection. Siblings stopped visiting after too many stolen possessions and broken promises. Wives and girlfriends left, taking children to protect them from the horror. The isolation was nearly complete. Users surrounded only by others in similar circumstances. They formed grim communities in abandoned buildings and derelict apartments, sharing recipes and injection equipment, watching each other die slowly. These groups provided the only human connection remaining in their lives. The daily routine became mechanical and desperate. Wake up sick from withdrawal, already late for the 90-minute clock. Cook a batch using whatever chemicals were available, often substituting ingredients when the preferred ones weren't accessible. Inject immediately to stop the muscle cramps and nausea. Experience 45 minutes of relief followed by 45 minutes of fading euphoria. Then the sickness returned, crashing down harder each time. Cook again. Inject again. The cycle repeated 15 times daily, every day, without variation. There was no space for anything else. No work, no relationships, no activities beyond acquiring ingredients and administering the drug. The financial calculation that made Krokodil appealing evaporated once medical costs entered the equation. The $8 daily drug cost was real, but the destroyed tissue required treatment costing hundreds of thousands of dollars. Surgeries, antibiotics, wound care supplies, and extended hospitalizations created bills that would take lifetimes to repay. Users couldn't access this care anyway because hospitals turned them away or they left against medical advice. The economic advantage was an illusion that disappeared the moment consequences materialized. They had traded heroin's financial burden for a medical catastrophe that was infinitely more expensive. Neighborhoods where Krokodil took hold transformed into zones of visible decay. Property values collapsed as residents fled areas known for high user populations. Businesses closed because customers avoided streets where they might encounter addicts with exposed bones. Parks became unusable, playgrounds abandoned, public spaces ceded to users who had nowhere else to go. The communities experienced compounding decay. Economic depression led to addiction. Addiction drove away remaining economic activity. Increased poverty created more addiction. The spiral fed itself with no bottom in sight. Children growing up in these areas witnessed horrors that shaped their psychology permanently. They saw neighbors with rotting limbs, encountered users collapsed in hallways, found injection equipment in playgrounds. Some children developed PTSD from exposure to this violence against the human body. Others became desensitized, viewing the horror as normal background reality. Either outcome was devastating. The epidemic's psychological impact extended far beyond direct users to traumatize entire communities and damage generations of young people. The visual horror created by Krokodil exceeded anything from traditional drug epidemics. Heroin overdose deaths were tragic, but the victims looked like people who had fallen asleep. Cocaine addiction caused weight loss and erratic behavior, but users maintained human appearance. Methamphetamine led to dental problems and skin picking, but nothing approaching Krokodil's grotesque disfigurement. Walking corpses with exposed bones and rotting flesh violated fundamental human expectations about what bodies should look like. The uncanny valley effect. The discomfort from seeing something almost but not quite human was in full effect. Healthcare workers treating Krokodil patients frequently developed secondary trauma from the exposure. Emergency room nurses who had handled gruesome accidents for decades found themselves overwhelmed by the relentless stream of decomposing addicts. Surgeons experienced nightmares about the surgeries they performed, cutting away flesh that crumbled like rotted wood. The psychological toll on medical staff was severe enough that some hospitals provided counselling specifically for workers treating Krokodil cases. Many physicians simply refused to work with these patients anymore, unable to handle the emotional burden. Photographers and journalists documented the epidemic with varying degrees of ethics. Some approached the work with genuine desire to raise awareness and prompt policy changes. They spent time with users, learned their stories, and presented them as human beings trapped in tragedy rather than moral failures deserving punishment. Others engaged in exploitation, seeking shocking images that would go viral without concern for the subject's dignity. Photographs of exposed bones and rotting flesh circulated globally, often without context about the economic and social conditions that created the epidemic. The ethical dilemma facing documentarians was genuine. Not photographing the horror meant the general public remained ignorant of the epidemic's scale and brutality. Photographing it risked turning human suffering into trauma porn for audiences seeking morbid entertainment. The most responsible journalists tried walking this line carefully, including context and policy analysis alongside graphic images. But even well-intentioned documentation couldn't fully escape the exploitation inherent in displaying someone's worst moments to the world. Users who agreed to be photographed often didn't appreciate how widely the images would spread. Television documentaries about Krokodil achieved massive viewership in Russia and internationally. The most-watched program drew 12 million viewers in Russia alone, making it one of the highest-rated documentaries in the country's history. International outlets like BBC, Vice, and National Geographic produced their own coverage, each bringing different perspectives and quality levels. The attention raised awareness but also sensationalized the issue, reducing complex social problems to shocking spectacle. Policymakers cited the documentaries when finally taking action, though cynics noted they only acted once the images became too horrifying to ignore politically. Users who participated in documentaries often did so hoping to fund treatment or warn others away from the drug. Most received little or no payment for their participation, their suffering packaged into profitable content without meaningful compensation. A few became minor celebrities in the drug culture, recognized from television appearances. This fame was hollow and occasionally dangerous, making them targets for police harassment or curiosity seekers. The small number who successfully used documentary participation to access treatment found themselves forever defined by their lowest moments, their recovery overshadowed by shocking imagery. The age at first use was dropping steadily by 2010. Initial users were primarily in their late 20s and 30s, people who had established heroin habits before Krokodil appeared. By 2010, teenagers were starting directly with Krokodil, skipping the heroin phase entirely. A 17-year-old could observe older addicts using, see them achieving the desired high despite obvious physical consequences, and decide the trade-off was acceptable. The psychological development of teenagers makes long-term consequence evaluation difficult. Immediate relief from current suffering takes precedence over abstract future harm. Krokodil was recruiting younger victims who would die even sooner. Female users faced additional complications from societal judgment and gender-specific health consequences. The 85% male user population meant women were minorities in a male-dominated drug culture. Many female users had started using with boyfriends or husbands, their addictions tied to relationship dynamics. The visible disfigurement carried different social consequences for women who faced harsher judgment about their appearance. Pregnancy while using Krokodil created nightmarish scenarios: the fetus exposed to toxic chemicals, the mother unable to stop injecting, healthcare providers facing impossible ethical decisions about intervention. Some communities experienced total generational collapse, where substantial portions of young men were actively dying from Krokodil. Small industrial towns with populations of 20 to 30,000 lost hundreds of young men over several years. The demographic impact was measurable. Gender imbalances appeared as death rates for men aged 20 to 35 exceeded normal rates by factors of 5 or 10. Towns faced futures without working-age male populations, communities that couldn't maintain themselves because an entire generation had been chemically erased. The damage would take decades to repair if recovery was even possible. The Russian government finally acknowledged the Krokodil epidemic publicly in 2011, nearly a decade after the first documented cases. Politicians had known about the problem for years, but avoided action that might anger pharmaceutical lobbyists or require budget allocations for treatment programs. The media coverage reached critical mass in 2010, forcing acknowledgement that could no longer be politically ignored. Deputy Health Minister Igor Lansky admitted in a press conference that Russia faced an unprecedented drug crisis, though he provided no specific policy proposals for addressing it. Public health officials had been advocating for codeine restrictions since 2006 with no success. They presented data showing the direct correlation between over-the-counter codeine availability and Krokodil use. They demonstrated that every country where codeine required prescriptions had zero or near zero Krokodil cases. The solution was obvious and simple: make codeine prescription only. But pharmaceutical companies fought this aggressively, arguing that millions of Russians relied on codeine for legitimate pain relief. The industry claimed restrictions would create unnecessary suffering for patients with headaches, menstrual cramps, and minor injuries. The pharmaceutical lobby's argument held weight in a system where corruption was standard practice. Companies made substantial campaign contributions to politicians who opposed codeine restrictions. Industry representatives sat on advisory boards that influenced health policy. The revolving door between pharmaceutical companies and government regulators was well established. This structural corruption prevented action despite mounting deaths. The industry prioritized profits over human lives with ruthless efficiency, and the political system enabled this prioritization through institutional capture. Regional authorities in areas hit hardest by Krokodil began implementing local restrictions without waiting for federal action. Irkutsk Oblast limited codeine sales to prescription only in 2010, one of the first regions to act. Krokodil use dropped by 70% within 6 months. The success was dramatic and immediate. Users either switched to other drugs, sought treatment, or traveled to neighboring regions where codeine remained available. The local experiment proved that supply restrictions worked, providing ammunition for advocates pushing federal policy changes. The federal government moved with agonizing slowness despite clear evidence. Multiple legislative proposals for codeine restrictions failed between 2009 and 2011, killed in committee or voted down after pharmaceutical industry pressure. Politicians publicly expressed concern about Krokodil while privately accepting industry money to oppose solutions. The disconnect between rhetoric and action was brazen. Voters watched their children die while elected officials blocked the one intervention that could have saved them. The betrayal fueled cynicism about government responsiveness to public health crises. June 2012 marked the turning point when Russia finally implemented nationwide codeine restrictions. The law required prescriptions for any medication containing codeine above a minimal threshold. Pharmacists faced criminal penalties for over-the-counter sales. The policy took effect immediately without the transition period pharmaceutical companies had lobbied for. Within weeks, codeine disappeared from pharmacy shelves except for prescription holders. The sudden supply disruption caught users off guard, many still believing they could continue accessing their primary ingredient indefinitely. The impact was swift and measurable. Krokodil use plummeted by over 90% within 2 years of the restrictions taking effect. Hospital admissions for Krokodil-related tissue damage dropped from thousands monthly to dozens. Emergency rooms that had been overwhelmed with rotting addicts found themselves treating normal patient volumes again. The epidemic that had seemed unstoppable simply evaporated once the key ingredient became inaccessible. The tragedy was how long this simple solution took to implement, and how many lives were lost during the delay. Users faced immediate crisis when codeine vanished from pharmacies. Those still physically dependent on desomorphine experienced severe withdrawal with no legal way to obtain their drug of choice. Some sought legitimate prescriptions by faking pain symptoms to doctors, but physicians had been warned about drug-seeking behavior and refused most requests. Others tried traveling to neighboring countries where regulations hadn't changed, but Kazakhstan and Ukraine were implementing their own restrictions simultaneously. The supply chain that had fueled the epidemic collapsed globally within months. The switch back to heroin was perhaps inevitable, but represented progress in a grim way. Heroin prices had remained high, but users facing Krokodil withdrawal decided financial ruin was preferable to the alternative. At least heroin didn't rot their flesh off. The tissue damage stopped progressing once users quit injecting toxic chemical cocktails, even if they replaced Krokodil with a different opioid. Emergency rooms noticed the shift. Fewer necrotic wounds, more standard overdose cases. From a harm reduction perspective, the transition represented improvement despite being far from ideal. Some chemists attempted adapting Krokodil synthesis to use alternative precursors. Rumours circulated about methods using over-the-counter medications that remained available, particularly dextromethorphan from cough syrup or oxycodone from prescription painkillers. These adaptations never gained widespread traction. The modified synthesis was more complex, the ingredients more expensive, and the resulting product reportedly inferior. Users who tried these alternative recipes generally abandoned them quickly, reverting to heroin or other established drugs rather than experimenting with untested chemistry. Designer drugs entered the market as users sought alternatives to both heroin and Krokodil. Synthetic cannabinoids sold as Spice, or K2, became popular despite causing psychotic episodes and seizures. Synthetic cathinones like mephedrone offered stimulant effects that partially filled the gap. Alpha PVP, marketed as bath salts, created a brief but intense epidemic before regulations banned it. Each new drug brought its own dangers and complications, but none approached Krokodil's visible horror. The harm reduction community viewed this as progress despite the ongoing substance abuse. Fentanyl's emergence in global opioid markets during the mid-2000s potentially prevented Krokodil from resurging or spreading internationally. Chinese manufacturers began producing fentanyl and its analogues in industrial quantities, creating a cheap synthetic opioid more potent than heroin. Fentanyl carried its own lethal risks through overdose, but at least it didn't cause tissue necrosis. The drug flooded into Russia and other markets, providing users with an alternative that was affordable, available, and didn't require home chemistry. If Krokodil had appeared 5 years later, fentanyl might have prevented it from ever gaining traction. Ukraine implemented codeine restrictions in 2013 after watching Russia's experience closely. The Ukrainian epidemic had been smaller than Russia's, but still significant, with estimated user populations in the tens of thousands. The restrictions had identical effects, immediate collapse in crocodile use, shift back to heroin and other drugs, dramatic reduction in hospital cases. Kazakhstan followed with similar policies in 2014. Georgia made codeine prescription only in 2015. The international response was uncoordinated but ultimately comprehensive across the former Soviet Union. Western European countries tightened codeine controls proactively, despite having minimal crocodile problems. The UK had already required prescriptions for codeine above certain doses, which probably prevented epidemic spread. France, Germany, and other nations reviewed their policies and implemented additional safeguards. The European Monitoring Centre for Drugs and Drug Addiction issued guidelines recommending prescription requirements for all codeine products. The international public health community treated Krokodil as a warning. Preventing epidemics was easier than stopping them once established. The World Health Organization published comprehensive reports on Krokodil between 2012 and 2015, documenting the epidemic's rise and decline. These reports became reference material for drug policy experts globally, cited in countless academic papers and policy documents. The WHO emphasized that Krokodil demonstrated how drug users will manufacture dangerous substances when faced with supply disruptions of their preferred drugs. The lesson was that prohibition without addressing demand simply shifts consumption to more hazardous alternatives. Effective policy required both supply control and treatment access. United Nations agencies incorporated Krokodil into broader discussions about drug policy reform. The UN Office on Drugs and Crime used the epidemic as evidence that purely punitive approaches to drug control were inadequate. They advocated for treating addiction as a public health issue rather than purely criminal justice concern. Conservative member states resisted this framing, maintaining that drug use was fundamentally a moral failing requiring punishment. The debate continued, with Krokodil serving as a case study for both sides. Proof that restriction worked, or proof that lack of treatment caused catastrophe, depending on interpretation. Non-governmental organizations working in addiction treatment documented lessons from the Krokodil epidemic. Groups like Harm Reduction International emphasized that the tragedy demonstrated the critical importance of medication-assisted treatment. If Russia had allowed methadone maintenance, users would have had alternatives to Krokodil when heroin became unaffordable. The NGO community used Krokodil to argue for comprehensive drug policy reform, including legal access to substitution therapy, needle exchanges, and treating addiction as medical rather than criminal issue. Media attention declined rapidly after codeine restrictions took effect, and dramatic imagery became scarce. Journalists covering the epidemic moved on to other stories once the shock value diminished. This created a problematic cycle where public awareness depended on sensational content, meaning media only covered drug issues when they reached catastrophic levels. The gradual work of prevention and treatment couldn't compete for attention against images of exposed bones. This media pattern potentially contributed to delayed responses by making crises invisible until they became undeniable. The Krokodil epidemic's decline paradoxically helped by removing it from public consciousness. Some drug policy experts worried that extensive coverage of horrifying consequences might actually attract certain personality types seeking extreme experiences. The forbidden fruit effect meant that graphic warnings sometimes increased curiosity rather than deterring use. As media coverage faded, Krokodil became less culturally salient, reducing the risk that vulnerable individuals might seek it out based on sensationalized reports. The drug needed to become boring for prevention efforts to succeed. Current estimates place active Krokodil users in the low thousands globally, down from over 100,000 at the epidemic's peak. Sporadic cases still appear in Russian hospitals, usually isolated users who somehow maintained access to codeine through stockpiling or black market sources. these remnant cases no longer represent an epidemic but rather individual tragedies. The massive mortality during the epidemic's height means that many long-term users are simply dead, removed from the using population through attrition. Survivors mostly transition to other drugs or achieve sobriety. The death toll from Krokodil will never be known precisely. Official mortality statistics don't separate Krokodil deaths from other drug-related fatalities. Many users died from infections and organ failure without the underlying cause being documented properly. Rural areas had minimal medical surveillance, meaning deaths went unrecorded entirely. Conservative estimates place Russian deaths between 10 and 15,000, but the true number likely exceeds 30,000 when accounting for undocumented cases. Each death represented not just a statistic, but a young person whose life was consumed by desperation and inadequate social support. Regional variation in mortality reflected differences in epidemic intensity and healthcare access. Irkutsk Oblast probably lost over 1,000 young men to Krokodil between 2003 and 2014. Smaller industrial cities like Magnitogorsk and Nizhny Tagil had proportionally similar losses. Moscow and St. Petersburg saw fewer deaths relative to population because healthcare was better and heroin remained more accessible. The geographic pattern of mortality matched economic deprivation almost perfectly, demonstrating that drug epidemics concentrate where social safety nets have failed most completely. The psychological scars on survivors and communities will persist for generations. People who watched friends and family members rot alive carry trauma that doesn't heal easily. Children who grew up in neighborhoods devastated by Krokodil learned that the world was cruel and bodies were fragile. Healthcare workers who treated thousands of rotting patients can never unsee what they witnessed. The epidemic left invisible wounds throughout Russian society that will influence attitudes, behaviors, and policies for decades. Some communities may never fully recover from losing substantial portions of their young adult populations. The Krokodil epidemic revealed fundamental truths about addiction that society prefers to ignore. Users didn't choose flesh-eating chemicals over safety because they were stupid or morally deficient. They chose immediate relief from withdrawal over abstract future consequences because the human brain isn't wired to prioritize distant threats over present suffering. The decision-making calculus was rational within the context of severe physical dependency and limited alternatives. Understanding this doesn't excuse the choices but explains why people made them repeatedly despite obvious dangers. Economic desperation created the conditions where Krokodil could flourish. Every major drug epidemic in history has corresponded with periods of economic collapse and social disruption. The opium crisis in China followed imperial decline and foreign domination. America's crack epidemic emerged during deindustrialization and urban decay. Krokodil appeared in post-Soviet Russia, where an entire economic system had disintegrated, leaving millions without jobs, purpose, or hope. The correlation between economic hardship and drug abuse isn't coincidental but causal in ways that demand policy responses beyond law enforcement. Unemployment above 30% creates populations with nothing to lose. Young men in Siberian industrial cities watched their futures evaporate as factories closed. The Soviet system had provided guaranteed employment, housing, and social services. The capitalist transition destroyed those guarantees without replacing them with viable alternatives. These men faced decades of poverty and meaninglessness stretching ahead. Heroin offered temporary escape. When heroin became unaffordable, Krokodil provided the same service at lower cost. The drug wasn't the problem, but a symptom of underlying structural failures. Healthcare system inadequacy transformed addiction into catastrophe. Countries with robust addiction treatment infrastructure rarely see drug epidemics reach Krokodil's scale. When addicts can access methadone maintenance or other substitution therapies, they don't resort to cooking chemicals in their kitchens. When pain patients receive adequate medical care, they don't turn to street drugs for relief. Russia's healthcare collapse during the 1990s eliminated addiction treatment capacity exactly when it was needed most. The resulting vacuum filled with the worst possible alternative. The methadone prohibition was particularly catastrophic. Decades of research prove that medication-assisted treatment reduces mortality, improves quality of life, and facilitates recovery from opioid addiction. Russia's ideological opposition to methadone, based on viewing it as replacing one addiction with another, ignored this evidence completely. The policy condemned addicts to binary choices between agonizing withdrawal and continued use. Some percentage would have continued using regardless, but thousands could have stabilized on methadone rather than dying from Krokodil complications. The death toll from this policy decision is measurable. Inadequate pain management created initial dependencies that led to addiction. Doctors overprescribed opioids for minor pain, while underprescribing for severe chronic conditions. Patients with legitimate pain needs couldn't access adequate treatment through medical channels and self-medicated using pharmacy codeine. This pattern isn't unique to Russia. The American opioid epidemic followed similar trajectories where prescription restrictions pushed dependent users toward more dangerous alternatives like heroin and fentanyl. The policy lesson is that abruptly restricting opioids without providing treatment alternatives simply shifts users to black market drugs. Personal responsibility rhetoric obscures systemic failures that create addiction epidemics. Conservative politicians and commentators emphasized individual choices, arguing that users deserve their fates for injecting gasoline. This framing conveniently ignored the contexts in which those choices occurred: unemployment, poverty, inadequate healthcare, limited treatment options, and pharmaceutical lobbying that delayed restrictions. Focusing on personal responsibility allows society to avoid addressing root causes that require expensive systemic interventions. It's cheaper politically to blame victims than to fix structural problems. The Krokodil epidemic demonstrated that people will use whatever drugs are available regardless of consequences. Drug policy based on prohibition alone fundamentally misunderstands addiction's nature. Users facing withdrawal don't perform careful risk-benefit analysis. They seek relief from immediate suffering using whatever means are accessible. Restricting heroin didn't reduce opioid addiction. It redirected users towards something worse. Restricting codeine worked only because alternatives like pharmaceutical heroin weren't available, forcing users back to black market heroin that was at least somewhat safer than Krokodil. Comparison to America's opioid crisis reveals similar patterns despite different contexts. American pharmaceutical companies aggressively marketed OxyContin and other prescription opioids during the 1990s and 2000s, creating millions of dependent users. When regulations tightened and prescriptions became harder to obtain, many users switched to heroin. Then fentanyl entered the market, cheaper and more potent but far more lethal. American overdose deaths now exceed 100,000 annually, vastly more than Krokodil killed. The drugs differ, but the underlying dynamic is identical: restrict supply without addressing demand, and users find increasingly dangerous alternatives. Wealth doesn't prevent epidemics, but changes their character. America has vastly more resources than Russia for addiction treatment, yet its opioid crisis kills more people annually than Krokodil killed in total. The difference is visibility. American users die quietly from overdoses that look like sleep, while Krokodil users rotted visibly. American media covered the opioid crisis extensively, but without the shock imagery that characterized Krokodil reporting. Public response reflected this difference: sympathy for overdose victims versus horror at Krokodil users. Both epidemics stemmed from identical root causes. The chemistry lesson was that desomorphine itself wasn't uniquely dangerous. Pharmaceutical-grade Permanid used in Swiss hospitals never caused tissue necrosis because it was pure. The horror came entirely from contaminants in the street synthesis, heavy metals, acids, solvents, and toxic byproducts. If Russian authorities had responded to Krokodil by providing pharmaceutical desomorphine through supervised injection sites, they could have eliminated the flesh-eating aspect while addressing addiction through harm reduction. Switzerland's heroin-assisted treatment programs prove this approach works, but ideological opposition to harm reduction made such solutions politically impossible. Prohibition without harm reduction creates worst-case outcomes. If society's goal is minimizing death and suffering from drug use, the evidence overwhelmingly supports harm reduction approaches: supervised injection sites, needle exchanges, drug checking services, and medication-assisted treatment. These interventions reduce mortality, prevent disease transmission, and create pathways to recovery. Yet many jurisdictions reject harm reduction based on moral objections to enabling drug use. This moralizing kills people. The Krokodil epidemic demonstrated that users will inject gasoline if that's their only option. Providing safer alternatives saves lives even if it offends sensibilities. The visual horror of Krokodil became anti-drug propaganda worldwide despite questionable effectiveness. Governments and NGOs used graphic images in prevention campaigns, hoping to deter potential users through fear. Research on fear-based drug education shows mixed results at best. Some individuals are indeed deterred by seeing consequences. Others become curious or view warnings as exaggerated. The most at-risk populations, people already using opioids, aren't meaningfully influenced by images of worst-case outcomes. They know drugs are dangerous, but use them anyway because addiction overrides rational decision-making. Media coverage of Krokodil established templates for covering future drug crises. The emphasis on shocking imagery, the zombie drug framing, the focus on individual users rather than systemic causes. These patterns repeated with flakka, bath salts, and other designer drugs that briefly generated moral panics. This coverage raises awareness, but often counterproductively, by sensationalizing rather than explaining. The public learns that scary new drugs exist, but not why people use them, or what policies might actually help. Sensationalism sells newspapers, but doesn't inform effective policy. The epidemic's legacy includes permanent changes to international drug control. Codeine restrictions spread globally, affecting legitimate pain patients along with potential Krokodil users. Pharmaceutical regulations tightened worldwide, making some medications harder to access for people who need them. The precautionary principle dominated. Better to restrict access and create some suffering for pain patients than risk another Krokodil-like epidemic. This trade-off isn't necessarily wrong, but rarely gets acknowledged explicitly. Policy always involves choosing which harms to tolerate. Krokodil survivors carry visible reminders of the epidemic: amputees missing limbs, users with massive scars and tissue loss, people with chronic infections that never fully heal. These individuals bear physical marks of a social failure that extended far beyond their personal choices. They struggle with employment discrimination, social stigma, and ongoing medical needs. Society created conditions for their addiction, failed to provide treatment, and now largely ignores their existence. They're living monuments to systemic callousness disguised as personal responsibility rhetoric. The youngest victims of the epidemic are now adults, children who grew up in neighborhoods devastated by Krokodil. Research on adverse childhood experiences shows that exposure to violence, drug abuse, and community trauma creates lasting psychological damage. These young adults have higher rates of mental health problems, substance abuse, and difficulty forming healthy relationships. The epidemic's impact will echo through generations as traumatized children become parents, potentially perpetuating cycles of dysfunction. Breaking these cycles requires investment in mental health services and community rebuilding that Russia hasn't prioritized. International cooperation on drug policy remains inadequate despite lessons from Krokodil. Countries still pursue largely independent approaches to drug control, creating loopholes and regulatory arbitrage. If Russia had coordinated with neighbouring states on codeine restrictions, the epidemic might have ended years earlier. If Western Europe had preemptively restricted codeine, Krokodil might never have appeared there at all. But national sovereignty and pharmaceutical industry interests prevent the level of coordination that effective drug control requires. Users exploit these gaps while policymakers resist the loss of autonomy that coordination demands. The ongoing challenge is that new drugs will continue emerging as users seek alternatives to restricted substances. Chemistry enables synthesis of thousands of potential psychoactive compounds. When authorities ban one substance, chemists create analogues that circumvent regulations temporarily. The cat-and-mouse game is unwinnable through restriction alone. China has become the primary source for novel synthetic drugs, manufacturing designer substances that skirt international controls. Each new drug carries unknown risks. Some will be relatively benign, others might exceed Krokodil's horror. The fundamental problem remains unaddressed in most jurisdictions. Why do people want to use drugs badly enough to risk death? The answer involves pain, physical and psychological, that inadequate social systems fail to alleviate. People use drugs to escape chronic pain, trauma, depression, anxiety, and existential despair. Until societies provide better solutions to these underlying conditions, drug epidemics will continue cycling through different substances. The specific chemical changes, but the human suffering driving use persists. Harm reduction advocates argue that drug use is inevitable in any society, and policy should minimize damage rather than attempting impossible elimination of use. This pragmatic approach conflicts with moral frameworks viewing drug use as fundamentally wrong regardless of circumstances. The debate continues with high stakes. Thousands of lives hang in the balance. Krokodil demonstrated that moralistic policies kill people when they prevent pragmatic interventions. But changing deeply held beliefs about right and wrong proves nearly impossible even when evidence clearly shows a better path. The Krokodil epidemic's memory fades as new crises demand attention. Fentanyl now kills far more people annually than Krokodil killed in total. Methamphetamine use is rising globally. Synthetic cannabinoids cause psychotic episodes and organ damage. Each crisis generates temporary alarm followed by inadequate response and eventual acceptance as a background condition. Society develops tolerance for drug deaths the way individuals develop tolerance for substances. The number that once shocked becomes normalized. 30,000 dead from Krokodil would have seemed unimaginable in 2002. By 2015 it was a footnote. The thin line between medicine and poison isn't chemical but contextual. Desamorphine in pharmaceutical form helped patients. Desamorphine synthesized with gasoline killed users. The molecule was identical, but purity, dosage, and administration method determine whether it healed or destroyed. This principle applies to all drugs. Context determines outcomes more than inherent chemical properties. Policy that ignores context inevitably fails. Krokodil taught this lesson at the cost of tens of thousands of lives. Whether anyone learned remains uncertain as new epidemics emerge following identical patterns.